What if the very urge to succeed carried within it the seeds of your downfall? Marcus had chased triumph his entire career, landing high-profile clients, securing funding, and earning praise, but each time victory loomed, he found a way to trip himself up. He would delay sending that game-changing pitch, rewrite the same sentence 30 times, and invent last-minute imperfections that froze his progress. Success became a double-edged sword, exhilarating in theory, yet haunted by a relentless inner impulse to pull back. The night before his company's major product launch, Marcus lay awake obsessing over every detail. He'd rehearsed the live demo until his voice faltered and repackaged marketing materials until they blurred together. And yet, as midnight passed, he convinced himself that an extra tweak would guarantee perfection. In the pre-dawn hours, with yawning investors waiting, Marcus was deep in code, refining nothing. By sunrise, the launch was postponed, momentum drained, and team morale weakened. This pattern had shadowed Marcus for years. Each accolade triggered a surge of panic. What if the next stage exposed his flaws? What if this success revealed him as a fraud? So he created barriers, missed deadlines, fabricated technical issues, abrupt cancellations, ensuring that achievements never stuck long enough to threaten his self-image. His towering ambition collided with an unseen force pulling him back, leaving him stuck in a cycle of near wins and self-sabotage. Marcus's story reflects a hidden saboteur within many high achievers, unconscious complexes that hijack even the best-laid plans. When ambition eclipses self-trust, the psyche mobilizes protective mechanisms, perfectionism, procrastination, fear of visibility, that ensure failure just enough to keep the inner critic comfortably hidden. Passing this paradox, how the drive for success morphs into a self-destructive blockade, reveals Jung's complex warning. Until we uncover the psychological drivers behind sabotage, we may never cross the finish line we so desperately seek. Jung discovered that the human psyche operates like a hidden ecosystem, harboring autonomous fragments of consciousness called complexes. These psychological entities function independently from rational thought, possessing their own emotions, memories, and agendas that can seize control of behavior without conscious awareness. Unlike simple thoughts or feelings, complexes act as semi-independent personalities within the mind, each carrying a distinct charge of energy and purpose that can override deliberate intentions. Marcus's self-sabotage exemplified how complexes operate in daily life. When the moment for action arrived, a fragment of his psyche activated, one rooted in childhood experiences of criticism and perfectionist demands. This complex carried the emotional memory of never being good enough, of facing harsh judgment whenever he revealed his true capabilities. The complex didn't speak in words, but through bodily sensations: the tightening chest before presentations, the compulsive need to delay important emails, the sudden inspiration to reorganize his entire strategy just hours before launch. Jung identified complexes as clusters of associated ideas, images, and emotions that form around core wounds or unresolved conflicts. They develop during formative experiences when the ego cannot fully process intense emotional content, causing these fragments to split off and develop their own internal logic. Over time, these autonomous pieces gather related memories, beliefs, and behavioral patterns, creating powerful psychological forces that operate below the threshold of conscious awareness. The complexity of Marcus's perfectionism revealed multiple layers of psychological organization. His success-sabotaging complex contained not just fear of failure, but fear of success itself, the terror that achievement would bring unwanted attention, increased expectations, and inevitable exposure as inadequate. This complex had learned that staying safely below the radar of complete success offered protection from the devastating criticism that once shattered his young psyche during childhood achievements that went unrecognized or were harshly judged. Each time Marcus approached a breakthrough moment, this autonomous complex would activate its protective protocols. It would flood his consciousness with compelling reasons to delay, perfect, or abandon his efforts. The complex didn't operate through logical argument, but through emotional overwhelm, sudden anxiety attacks, inexplicable loss of confidence, or compelling distractions that felt more urgent than his actual goals. Marcus experienced these interruptions as personal failures, rather than recognizing them as the activation of an unconscious psychological system designed to keep him safe from perceived threats. Jung emphasized that complexes possess their own intelligence and survival instinct. They resist change because their primary function is psychological protection, even when that protection has become counterproductive. Marcus's success-sabotaging complex had developed sophisticated methods to maintain control, creating plausible reasons for delay generating perfectionist standards that could never be met, and triggering imposter syndrome precisely when achievement was within reach. The complex had learned that preventing success was safer than risking the imagined catastrophe of being fully seen and potentially rejected. The autonomous nature of complexes explains why willpower alone cannot overcome self-sabotage. Marcus couldn't simply decide to stop sabotaging himself because the complex operated independently of his conscious decisions. When activated, the complex would hijack his neural pathways, triggering automatic responses that felt completely justified in the moment. He would genuinely believe that one more revision was necessary, that the timing wasn't quite right, or that the project needed fundamental restructuring just hours before launch. Understanding complexes as autonomous psychological entities transformed Marcus's relationship to his self-sabotaging behaviors. Instead of viewing his delays and perfectionism as personal character flaws, he began recognizing them as the protective actions of an internal system that had once served a vital function. This recognition marked the beginning of his ability to work with rather than against these unconscious forces, learning to dialogue with his complexes rather than being blindly controlled by them. The revelation of Jung's complex theory illuminated why traditional approaches to overcoming self-sabotage often fail. Logic, willpower, and positive thinking cannot effectively counter autonomous psychological forces that operate below conscious awareness. Only by acknowledging the complex as a legitimate part of the psyche with its own protective purpose could Marcus begin the delicate process of renegotiating his relationship with success and achievement. Beneath Marcus's corporate bravado lay a persistent, corrosive voice, his inner critic that sabotaged every step towards success. This relentless commentator emerged from early childhood, when Marcus's worth felt conditional on flawless performance. His mother, a high-achieving academic, celebrated perfect report cards but grew impatient with any sign of self-doubt. After one B grade, she sighed heavily and recited her disappointment aloud. Young Marcus internalized the lesson. Love and approval depended on spotless results. As Marcus advanced through school, this dynamic cemented his inner critic's foundation. The critic whispered that any hint of inadequacy would provoke rejection. Slipping meant losing esteem and connection. It equated vulnerability with failure, so Marcus learned to suppress uncertainties and mask any sense of imperfection. He became a relentless self-checker, scanning for flaws before anyone else could discover them. Jung described the inner critic as a secondary ego function born from introjection, when a child unconsciously absorbs parental voices into the psyche. For Marcus, his mother's voice merged with social expectations, creating a powerful inner jury that judged relentlessly. This internal authority insisted that mistakes were unforgivable and partial success was a hollow defeat. Consequently, any step toward a major goal triggered the critic's alarms, warning of impending shame and prompting self-censorship. The critic's origin traces back to formative experiences when Marcus first encountered disapproval. At age 7, he performed in a piano recital. A wrong note provoked his piano teacher's sharp rebuke in front of classmates, labeling the error unacceptable. Shame flooded 7-year-old Marcus, his face hot as his peers snickered. That single moment lodged deep in his unconscious, and every subsequent achievement awakened the fear of a similar public humiliation. In adolescence, the inner critic found fresh fuel in social comparison. Marcus watched classmates showcase flawless projects and praised achievements on social media. He internalized their triumphs as benchmarks he could never reach, amplifying his critic's messages. You're lagging behind, you'll never measure up, and you're a fraud among geniuses. Each comparison reinforced the belief that success carried a unique risk of exposure. By adulthood, the critic had grown into a formidable inner complex, an amalgam of critical parental voices, earlier humiliations, and societal ideals. It spoke in Joseph Campbell's Ring of Power, urging control and perfection. Even when Marcus experienced genuine competence, the critic belittled his efforts. "That's just luck," it hissed. "Soon you'll show your real limits." As a result, any genuine confidence triggered instant self-doubt, undermining momentum at critical junctures. Marcus's inner critic didn't merely cast doubt, it devised strategies to block success. When a deadline approached, the critic whispered that preparation was insufficient and encouraged endless revision. If an opportunity aligned perfectly with his goals, it cautioned that too much visibility would spark envy and ruin his reputation. Through these tactics, the critic preserved a status quo, keeping Marcus from risk and maintaining a predictable pattern, even at the expense of progress. Jung warned that the inner critic, left left unexamined, becomes an internal tyrant. It usurps the ego's rationality and sabotages conscious aims, driven by archaic survival scripts. Marcus experienced this firsthand. His attempts to rationalize procrastination and perfectionism were futile against the critic's emotional intensity. Logical planning meetings dissolved as his critic flooded him with what-if scenarios, hijacking decision-making and prompting retreat into safe but fruitless habits. Understanding the critic's origin empowered Marcus to disarm its tyranny. Awareness of its roots, introjected parental voices, and early humiliations allowed him to separate the critic's pronouncements from his authentic self. He began addressing the critic in the third person. "That's my perfectionist voice speaking." This psychological distancing reduced the critic's immediate power and opened space for conscious choice. Marcus then experimented with counter-voices, affirmations reflecting his true values and strengths. After each critical outburst, he countered with statements like, "I can learn from mistakes," or "My worth isn't defined by flawless performance." Repeated over weeks, these affirmations built an internal ally that challenged the critic's assertions, gradually reshaping his internal dialogue. He also revisited the formative memories that had given the critic life. In guided journaling sessions, Marcus wrote letters to his younger self after the piano recital, offering empathy, validation, and a new perspective. He reframed the teacher's rebuke as a one-time failure to recognize a child's effort, not an eternal judgment. These narrative interventions weakened the critic's emotional charge, turning old shame into understanding and compassion. Marcus's evolving relationship with his inner critic marked the beginning of authentic self-trust. No longer a hidden tyrant, the critic became a voice among many, its warnings considered but not definitive. With this transformation, Marcus could approach success without being ensnared by the critic's ancestral fears. He discovered that acknowledging the critic's origin and purpose allowed him to reclaim his ambitions, opening a path to fulfillment unblocked by the shadows of his past. Beneath Marcus's habitual doubts and perfectionism lies a more profound, shadowy force deeply embedded in his unconscious, the shadow drivers that propel self-sabotage. While the inner critic operates as the articulate voice of judgment and fear, the shadow consists of disowned parts of the self, unacknowledged emotions, desires, and fears that have been pushed underground because they are perceived as unacceptable or dangerous. These shadow elements do not disappear. Instead, they influence behavior from the darkness, often contradicting conscious goals and sabotaging success. Marcus harbored several shadow drivers from early life experiences. Foremost was a deep-seated belief of unworthiness. Though externally successful, he wrestled with an internal story that he was fundamentally flawed and undeserving of triumph. This wound originated in childhood neglect, a father emotionally distant and dismissive of Marcus's achievements. The internalized message whispered, "No matter what you do, you are never enough." Such beliefs formed a shadow foundation that expressed itself through recurring self-doubt and the compulsive undermining of progress. Another core shadow driver was fear of visibility. Success, Marcus learned unconsciously, meant exposure, not just to praise, but also scrutiny, envy, and potential punishment for stepping out of line. His early social environment emphasized conformity and punished standing out. This created a powerful tension. The desire to succeed collided with an equally strong drive to remain invisible and safe. Every instance of success sparked latent anxiety about becoming too exposed to judgment, pushing Marcus toward behaviors that minimized attention. Jung taught that shadow drivers are often formed during periods of trauma or relational wounding and are frozen psychological patterns that lack conscious integration. Marcus's shadow included emotions he had never fully allowed himself to feel: rage at his father's neglect, sorrow for unmet needs, and vulnerability around perfectionistic shame. Because these feelings were taboo, his psyche locked them away, simultaneously driving his compulsive chase for approval and triggering inner conflicts that exploded as self-sabotage. Shadow drivers often operate through symbolic enactment. For Marcus, abandoning crucial project deadlines or sabotaging pitches was an unconscious act of resistance, a way to enact the internal drama of unworthiness and fear. Each self-imposed obstacle recreated the emotional dynamics of past trauma, temporarily restoring a sense of psychic equilibrium, however dysfunctional. Psychologically, these acts served as a means to avoid the unbearable anxiety of confronting his shadow directly. The self-sabotage was also fueled by an unconscious contract with the shadow, a tacit agreement that certain psychological needs would only be met through maintaining the status quo of failure. The shadow promised protection through familiar suffering, even if it meant blocking growth. Marcus's psyche preferred the familiar discomfort of hidden wounds to the unknown risks of full success and exposure. This paradox explains why conscious attempts to override sabotage feel futile without engaging the shadow itself. Marcus's shadow drivers resembled the archetypal wounded victim and fearful outcast residing within. These figures seek to protect the self by withdrawing from reality or sabotaging success to prevent renewed hurt. The deeper the shadow's grip, the more compulsive and unconscious the self-defeating patterns become. Marcus embodied this archetype through his persistent avoidance and internal fear, unknowingly reenacting ancestral and personal traumas inherited across generations. Integrating shadow drivers requires courage to face what has been hidden. Jung insisted that personal growth depends on recognizing and embracing shadow elements, transforming them from destructive tyrants into sources of wisdom and strength. For Marcus, this meant becoming curious about his self-sabotage rather than judging it as failure, exploring emotional triggers, childhood memories, and recurring fears with compassionate awareness. Marcus began to journal his recurring self-sabotaging incidents, noting accompanying emotions and bodily sensations. He observed that each delay and self-criticism correlated with a surge of anxiety or dread, a shadow signal warning against perceived threat. Rather than fighting these impulses, he practiced mindful acknowledgement, saying internally, "I see you, fear and unworthiness. I hear your message." This shift diminished the shadow's charge from an explosive force to a gentle whisper. Shadow integration also involved reconnecting with disowned feelings. Marcus allowed himself to feel sorrow over his father's neglect and express anger safely through physical activity and art. By reclaiming these emotions, he loosened their unconscious hold, enabling fuller presence and clearer decision-making in his adult life. Gradually, the shadow drivers relinquished their tyranny over his ambitions, creating space for conscious self-authorship. Finally, Marcus cultivated new narratives, replacing the limiting internal scripts of unworthiness and fear. He rehearsed affirmations of belonging, resilience, and legitimacy, reinforcing his right to success and visibility. This narrative coercion involuntarily reprogrammed his shadow, facilitating a gradual but profound transformation in his relationship to achievement. The shadow drivers behind self-sabotage are not enemies but misunderstood parts of the self-seeking protection. By embracing these shadow aspects with empathy, Marcus began dismantling the hidden barriers to success. This integration marked a pivotal stage in transcending self-limiting patterns, opening pathways to authentic accomplishment free from unconscious sabotage. Marcus's journey toward genuine success culminated in embracing integration steps that transformed his complexes, softened the inner critic, and harmonized his shadow drivers. Self-sabotage begins as an unconscious defense, but it need not persist once the psyche's fragmented parts find synergy through conscious relationship and healing. Jung emphasized that awareness, acceptance, and dialogue are key to unlocking authentic potential blocked by unconscious forces. First, Marcus cultivated mindfulness, developing the ability to recognize automatic sabotaging behaviors as they arise without immediately reacting. By observing urges to delay, criticize, or distract with detached curiosity, he created a pause between impulse and action. This mental space allowed him to question the validity of the sabotaging message instead of slipping into reflexive defeat. Mindfulness became the foundation of conscious choice, dissolving the illusion that sabotage was inevitable. Second, Marcus engaged in active imagination, a Jungian technique that involves dialoguing with inner complexes and shadow elements through visualization and creative expression. He imagined sitting face to face with his perfectionist complex, inviting it to share its fears and needs. By acknowledging that the complex aimed to protect him from shame rather than attack him, Marcus shifted from opposition to partnership. This dialogue reduced the complex's defensive urgency and allowed for cooperative problem solving. Third, narrative rewriting played a pivotal role. Marcus traced the origins of his inner critic and shadow drivers through journaling and therapy, unraveling their emotional histories. He then then rewrote his internal scripts, replacing messages of inadequacy with affirmations of inherent worthiness and growth. This rewiring quieted the relentless critic and empowered his authentic voice to surface. He recognized that success did not require perfection, but sincere effort and self-compassion. Fourth, Marcus practiced self-compassion and boundary setting. Understanding that complexes and shadow drivers protect vulnerable parts of himself, he treated his psyche with kindness instead of harshness. He learned to set limits on obsessive self-scrutiny and stepped back when the critic's voice became overwhelming. This gentle self-parenting nurtured resilience and sustained motivation by reducing inner conflict fatigue. Fifth, Marcus fostered supportive relationships that reinforced his emerging integration. He sought mentors who validated his struggles and triumphs, creating external echoes of internal acceptance. Sharing his journey with trusted allies normalized his experiences and mitigated isolation, boosting his courage to face deeper psychological work. Community became a mirror reflecting his evolving self-worth. Sixth, Marcus incorporated ritual and symbolic acts to embody his transformation. Small ceremonies marking milestones, burning written fears, lighting candles for intention, or visualizing a phoenix rising anchored his psychological shifts in felt experience. These symbolic gestures activated unconscious acceptance and reinforced his commitment to growth beyond mere cognition. Seventh, he engaged regularly in somatic awareness practices, yoga, breathwork, and body scanning to reclaim psychological energy trapped in tension and anxiety. Healing complexes and shadow requires reconnecting fragmented mind-body communication, releasing stored trauma, and anchoring new patterns in the nervous system. The body's wisdom complemented conscious integration, deepening Marcus's transformation. Lastly, Marcus embraced patience, understanding that integration is not instant but unfolds in cycles of insight, resistance, and renewal. Some days complexes dominate, others reveal surprising cooperation. Success is not linear but dialectical, balancing acceptance and change. This perspective eased frustration and allowed Marcus to maintain steady progress. Through these integration steps, mindfulness, active imagination, narrative rewriting, self-compassion, relational support, ritual, somatic awareness, and patience, Marcus transcended the unconscious sabotages that once shackled him. He ceased battling internal enemies and instead cultivated an inner alliance that amplified resilience, authenticity, and aligned action. Jung's complex warning thus became a gateway. By illuminating and integrating hidden forces, Marcus unlocked a sustainable path to success grounded in wholeness. This transformation is available to anyone caught in self-sabotage cycles. With courage and conscious work, the inner critic's veil lifts, complexes become partners, and shadow drivers reveal deeper needs to be honored rather than hidden. Success blossoms when the psyche is no longer fragmented but engaged as a unified milieu, where all parts, even the wounded and fearful, have a voice in creating a life of meaning and achievement.